While much of the world wonders if the worst of COVID is behind us, why, nearly 4 years on, is the country where the coronavirus originated still under lock and key? Rare scenes of protest out of China, like in its most populous metropolis, Shanghai, spread during a weekend where citizens clamored for an end to draconian confinements in a nation of 1.4 billion. Rallies of several thousand can perhaps seem small, but they point to promises made in the wake of last month's Communist Party Congress that was supposed to signal a loosening of lockdowns. Why is the recently re-elected Xi Jinping doubling down? There's just a handful of cases are enough to shut entire cities. Are Chinese vaccines that ineffective in the face of the Omicron variant? At this point, we're asking also, will the authorities bend, or will it end in a crackdown? More broadly, what next for China's social contract, the one where citizens stay out of politics and in exchange, the government guarantees growth and stability? Has an invisible coronavirus broken that trust between the regime and its people? Today in the France 24 debate, we're wondering if China's reached its boiling point. And joining us is Anne-Marie Brady, International Relations Professor at the University of Canterbury. Thanks for being with us.
Kia ora.
From Cambridge, England, William Hurst, Professor of Chinese Development at Cambridge University. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me. Good to be here.
From Seattle, Dongshen Zhang, Associate Professor of Law at the University of Washington. Good to see you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And we welcome back, he's a former Beijing correspondent for the French news agency AFP, Pierre-Antoine Denet, author of The China File, analysis of a country on the edge of the abyss. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you very much.
The France 24 debate, where you could join the conversation you have on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. There were no big protests again this Monday in Beijing or Shanghai, but authorities visibly on edge, police checking phones for VPNs in areas where rallies happened over the weekend. More from Yinka Oyatare.
Hundreds of protesters brandished blank sheets of paper while chanting anti-COVID restriction slogans in Beijing from late Sunday to the early hours of Monday morning. It's a simple but significant symbol of defiance in China, where room for dissent has been all but eliminated. Protesters' anger directed at the country's zero-COVID policy.
I think we should go back to normal. We should go back to our normal lives.
In Shanghai Monday, authorities installed barricades in a bid to discourage the scenes of rebellion seen the night before in China's biggest city, with demonstrators chanting for an end to the Communist Party. During Sunday's turmoil, police quickly began arresting protesters as they desperately tried to disperse crowds. Along with Shanghai and Beijing, unrest also erupted in the Chinese cities of Chengdu, Guangzhou, Xi'an, and Wuhan, where the coronavirus first emerged. Several university campuses have also been rocked by demonstrations. The protests broke out following a deadly fire Thursday at an apartment block in the region of Xinjiang, where COVID lockdowns allegedly hampered rescue efforts. Accusations Chinese authorities deny. The protests are a sign that people are fed up with the country's zero-COVID approach, which has meant snap lockdowns and harsh restrictions. It's a policy that President Xi recently vowed to maintain.
We saw in that report, Pierre-Antoine Denet, people at one point chanting down with Xi Jinping, down with the Communist Party. Have we seen this before?
Well, it's nearly the first time in years. I remember a few months ago in Shanghai, there were just a small family shouting these slogans from their balcony.
Even now, though, is it anecdotal? Or?
No. That shows something. That shows that there is really a great despair among even among the Chinese youth. When you look at universities, what they are doing there, this shows.
William Hurst, do you agree?
I think that what we're seeing is the confluence of several previously disconnected strands or repertoires of contention, one of which is indeed student protest on university campuses, another of which is labor, and another of which is discontent around what you could call urban governance issues, right? So a lot of people are very upset about delivery of basic social services, responses to disasters like the tragic fire that happened in Urumqi last Thursday, or any number of things related to sort of the quotidian of daily life that have been disrupted, not only by the COVID lockdowns, but by other things. The anti-lockdown framing has provided a kind of master narrative for all of these strands to come together, and also for the articulation of these broader kind of systemic critiques of the Communist Party and of its leaders. So I think this may or may not last, but the fact that it's happening at all is notable.
Yeah, may or may not last. I mean, we're still wondering at this point, because again, we're talking about a nation of 1.4 billion. Is it anecdotal?
I think it depends on what we mean by anecdotal. It certainly doesn't seem to be every single person in the country, but the fact that we've seen these demonstrations in 10 or 15 cities at least, and that at least some of them have brought together these disparate constituencies and narratives is, I think, quite important. What is not clear is whether this will persist for more than a few days. And I actually tend to suspect that we're likely to see the strands begin to become delinked, or the interwoven strands will become frayed and separate back out again into distinct narratives of student protest, workers' protest, and governance issues protest. And the whole thing will probably die down of its own accord. But I could well be wrong, and it's dangerous to predict.
Anne-Marie Brady, does your crystal ball say the same?
Well, I don't think it's wise to use a crystal ball to predict the situation in China, but we do have some precedents to think about. We have the scenario in China in 1989 where the government used force, extreme force, against the population in in Beijing as well as in other cities in China, and that really pushed back the Chinese population and made it really clear to them that there were absolute limits on the extent to which they could express their discontent. But also in 1989, you had the people in Eastern Europe who saw the crackdown in China, and they responded with their own protests, and you had authorities in East Germany, as well as what was then Czechoslovakia, who did not suppress the protests, and then there was political change.
Yeah, I want to get back in a bit to that whether the whole world's connected on this one at the time. But Anne-Marie, let me ask you a little bit about the way they've been protesting. We saw in that report their use of white pieces of paper, that blank piece of paper saying that in a nod to censorship. Also, we have seen citizens of Beijing employing that stealth weapon they call sarcasm, with chants like "Zero COVID," "I want a COVID test," or "I want to scan my QR code." Your reaction to that?
Yeah, political satire was very much a really important device of resistance in the Cold War era. And it was the case that was very much a lot of political satire in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, and perhaps a bit more quietly in China too. There's some really famous political jokes of the Mao era. So this is a good sign. If people are getting cheeky and using the propaganda against the government, this shows the defiance and the strength of people's feeling. I think this is something we have not seen for years in China. This is truly significant, what is going on. It's happening in many, many cities. And people are not just saying we're unhappy about COVID. They're saying down with Xi Jinping. They're saying down with the Communist Party. That's the big difference from previous protests that there have been in China over select issues. For example, people didn't get their pensions when a factory closed down, or on environmental issues. People are saying down with the Communist Party, and also particularly targeting Xi Jinping. There's a lot of anger against him. So I think this is much broader than concern about zero COVID. There's more to it than that.
You agree, Dongshen Zhang?
I agree. I think this is broader, but I also look at the one character of this movement is that a lot of these demonstrators are young people, so the younger generation who are specifically hit hard by this COVID and the high unemployment rate. Therefore, the anger that they share with the overall population. But I think here is what I see, what is in common between 2022 and the Hong Kong demonstrations and 1989. So what you have in common is the younger generation are not happy with the regime and they are voicing their anger. And I think this is going to last for quite some time.
For quite some time, if you're saying young people are driving it, but of course, both the case of Hong Kong and 1989, in the end, dissent was crushed.
That would be a nightmare scenario that that we cannot rule out. I think we talk about the narratives for the leadership and the ruling elites. There's also a narrative about 1989, about the collapse of the Soviet Union. So they learn very different lessons from history. So their narratives would support a hardline policy and support a crackdown, because that if they didn't do that, then that would mean the end of the regime. So I think we have to be cautious to follow what is going to happen in China. My worry is that the government may take a very, very hardline position on this.
It's been difficult at times covering it. Authorities in Beijing claim that the BBC correspondent in Shanghai that they arrested had failed to show his press card. His employers reject that explanation. Here you see the images. He's saying, call the British consulate. They also claimed that he was detained for his own safety so that he wouldn't catch COVID. And as was mentioned earlier in our conversation by William Hurst, the last straw, you might say, came last week. That fire in a high-rise in the western Xinjiang province of Urumqi that left at least 10 dead. Angry protesters blame quarantine rules, which means the fire department didn't access in time. The government denies, though.
The city government of Urumqi has already held a relevant press conference in which it clearly stated the facts and truth and refuted these rumors and smears.
Pierre-Antoine Tonnet, I mentioned that daily briefing at the Chinese Foreign Ministry, and we talk about the BBC correspondent, because obviously for authorities in Beijing, it's about how this plays out domestically, but also internationally.
Absolutely. What we saw at the G20 in Bali was Xi Jinping trying to restart a dialogue with Western countries, especially the US, but also Japan. Why that? It's because the economy in China is going down very heavily. The unemployment also is rising very quickly, especially for the young people. The unemployment rate for the young people is around 20% now. This is unprecedented since a very long time. So this is also fueling discontent in China, especially among the young people. So what we see also is that in the last few years, the image of China abroad has been going down everywhere, almost everywhere, and also very fast. So
you might even say since COVID started, that was sort of the turning point.
It started before, because
with the Hong Kong protests?
Hong Kong, of course, and also the Uyghur problem, all that sort of things, but also the fact that China has been using a coercion against lots of countries. And so the atmosphere has been changing towards China. And that has, of course, changed a lot since the COVID started. So today, China needs the Western countries to restart the economy. And this is
well,
why...
if they needed to restart the economy, why then the zero COVID policy? You and I both saw
This is the big contradiction in China. You have the great master, Mr. Xi Jinping, who was the one who decided to start all this drive on the COVID management, which is a huge failure. But the thing is that the unwritten rule is that the CCP is always right. And when he's wrong, he never say it. And of course, since he's at the helm, Xi Jinping cannot say that he was wrong. So it's very difficult. So for the time being, I think maybe for the next few days, they will try to sort of relax a little bit the rules. But there is a danger that if the demonstrations continue, then bloodshed may come.
Bloodshed may come, you say. He may have a problem as the World Cup continues. With Chinese state television editing out images of maskless fans from around the planet together, enjoying the tournament in Qatar. And when you look at those images, first of all, let me ask you, Dongsheng Zhang, how much of a factor has it been? Has this been overplayed by the Western media? The fact that the World Cup is making the Chinese realize, hey, the rest of the world is opened up and not us?
Well, so it's very it's the deliberate policy for the official media in China to maintain that propaganda, to keep it. But in the meantime, it is a very challenging moment for them for many young demonstrators in the street in China. They are shouting the truth to the people. So I think this propaganda is facing a very fundamental challenge right now.
William Hurst, do you see a World Cup factor or not?
I think so. I'm very hard to quantify how large that factor is, because I think a lot of people understood intellectually that the rest of the world was not on the same page with China in terms of continuing lockdown and anti-COVID policies, that in other words, most of the rest of the world had moved on. But I think seeing people packed into stadiums night after night and seeing images of people without masks, which not all of which have been edited, it seems as though the editing has ramped up in the last day or two, actually, around that, from what I can gather, although I haven't been watching all the games on Chinese television. But my sense is that there's increasing concern among those in the government that people may be seeing this and realizing on a kind of more visceral level that the rest of the world is different. There's a famous online comment that made the rounds a few days ago from someone in China saying they felt as though they were watching football on another planet, and they wondered why their planet could not be like that.
So there's two possible explanations. We've heard one from Pierre-Antoine Donnet. The Communist Party's never wrong, and they don't want to back down now for reasons of pride. Of course, there's also the relative inefficiency of China's COVID vaccines. Science journal Nature estimates that those vaccines are no match for the latest variant. And you see that they have stated in their report that the level of immunity induced by the March 2022 vaccination campaign would be insufficient to prevent an Omicron wave that would result in exceeding critical care capacity with a projected peak demand of 15 times the existing capacity and 1.55 million deaths. Now, this is just a scenario, Anne-Marie Brady, and you warned us against using crystal balls. But is it a medical issue, or is it, as Pierre-Antoine was saying, an issue of hurt pride here?
Well, it's the strategy that the Chinese government has followed on dealing with COVID right from the very beginning. Has been disastrous for China. It's been disastrous for the world. You know, when they first had indications of the outbreak in around October 2019, The Chinese government tried to keep it secret. They tried to control it themselves. We have information about that, about the PLA bacterial warfare team going in. They allowed mass banquet to be held in Wuhan in mid-January. They lied about it to the CDC. They didn't allow Beijing CDC to tell the truth to their foreign counterparts. The WHO was sending out bad messages to the world. And now their own policies that they have developed, the so-called zero COVID, is just absolutely impossible to achieve. The way that the virus has mutated is that it's becoming so transmissible, and the variant that is dominant now is one that Chinese vaccines won't be able to deal with. So
yeah, but aren't you skipping? Anne-Marie, in the interest of balance here, aren't we skipping one phase? Because after all, the zero COVID policy was hailed at one point. The U.S. it was more than 1 million deaths because of COVID. Right now in China, I think that number is just a little bit north of 5,000, according to the official statistics. So for a while, it worked.
No. It didn't. And I was in a country that followed a sensible strategy on COVID in New Zealand, and Taiwan was another. So the US and the UK did not handle COVID well. Russia and Brazil did also not handle it well. But China's zero COVID policy really has relied on some old-fashioned approaches to pandemic management once it did get going, and they are not effective enough. And we do have vaccines now that could create immunity. China doesn't have those vaccines. They've been using their own vaccine. They've only just signed a deal with BioNTech, and they have a large number of elderly people who are not even vaccinated at all. So the zero COVID policy, it really has created a kind of the narrative is very damaging for the government, because it may have created temporary feeling of safety for people in China when they saw the terrible situations, say like in New York and in March 2020, or other cities like that, where the world, or Italy. In 2020, the world watched in horror. But China is facing the waves of Omicron that the rest of the world have faced without the immunity and without the vaccines, and without, I don't think they have Paxlovid in large amounts either. So their policies have not been good, and they have caused massive economic damage. So we saw zero growth for a period this year. And China was booming until COVID. So the anger against Xi is absolutely visceral. Chinese people have been told about the Chinese dream. Xi Jinping's turned it into the Chinese nightmare. He has really damaged China's prospects.
Yeah. China's street cred, but for now it still is. And I'll put it to you, William Hurst, it still is the world's factory. And even though we've focused a lot in the last week on the protests at the flagship iPhone factory by Taiwanese company Foxconn, a lot of those factories are still exporting to the West, still working at a clip. Are we not overplaying the slowdown in China?
It's very, very hard to get reliable, up-to-date information on exactly what's going on in all sectors of the economy. But I think it is fair to say that the impact of zero COVID on economic activity has indeed been devastating, that industry is operating at nowhere near capacity or where it should probably be. And the reason why we're seeing as many labor protests as we are, and the Foxconn protest is not the only one, there are many, many, many such protests, is precisely because factories are not working properly, workers aren't being paid, workers promised bonuses to return to assembly lines and essential work during the lockdown, haven't received those bonuses, workers have been locked inside factories and not allowed to leave. for fear that they might contract COVID and cause a shutdown. So it's not a happy place in the manufacturing sector at all, nor is China producing what it should be or operating smoothly in the context of global supply chains, which is one of the reasons we see such inflation in Europe.
All right. Still, as we were saying, the president doubling down. And we heard his words, Xi Jinping, at the outset of last month's party congress, where he was anointed for a third term.
In particular, in the face of the unexpected COVID-19 pandemic, we are working to give priority to the population and to human lives, to adhere to an unshakable zero-COVID dynamic policy, to lead a popular war, a total war, and a blockading war, to combat the pandemic, to protect the security and safety of the people to the highest level.
Dr. Shenzang, why those words, and what does it mean, a popular war?
It really shows the predicament of the propaganda in China. That is, the official narrative is that it is a people-centered policy, that we care about everybody, we care about equality, we care about health. But the reality is very radically different, right? So that is the predicament of the current Chinese politics, that you have the official position and the reality that are radically different. And that is exactly why people are so angry, because it shows that the official policy totally disregards of the daily life of ordinary people. And so that is the trouble that the current regime is facing.
The trouble with that the regime is facing, can't he just declare victory and retreat?
He could. That would be a more rational calculation. Or he could also have blamed some of the local municipal leaders for the failure of policy, and then take that as a reason to change. But that would be a more rational calculation. But based on what we know about Xi Jinping, that he may be much more stubborn than that. He may be much more holding a hardline position than that, and that would be a continued predicament for this regime until to the last point.
Pierre-Antoine Denet, we've been wondering ever since, or during, before, after that party congress, the 20th party congress that took place last month, if this was not Xi Jinping's Icarus moment, lifting those term limits. And yeah, coming out of this this moment, is it all about this one man, this decision, or this decision to double down on this zero COVID strategy? Is it more about a more general mindset within the country?
It's both, but it's rather targeting Mr. Xi Jinping himself. Why that? As we said before, he is the main leader who decided on this COVID management, which is a disaster. But also, why the regime has been taken by surprise by these demonstrations which spread around. They thought about that they could silence that, and, you know, with censorship and so forth, but they didn't succeed. And when we see these young people shouting down with Xi Jinping, that's very revealing that he is the target. And this, maybe they will use some kind of soft accommodation decisions, but they may be also having a hard decision to suppress these demonstrations. But in the long term, I think that this will have a big effect within the Communist Party leadership. Because,
what kind of big effect?
You see, at the end of the 20th Congress, he appeared as the triumph, as the really real leader with no opposition within the party. But this is wrong. The way he treated Mr. Hu Jintao, for example, his predecessor, was just shameful. Why he did that? He wanted to show his people in China and also foreigners that he is the uncontested leader. So that shows what? That he's fragile. He's not that strong. And within the party leadership, there are many people who actually are very afraid that he's imposing a solitary regime, imposing everything by himself.
One-man rule.
One-man rule. This is contested. You know, there are signs. There are many sources in China, of course not identified, who say that there are growing discontent within the party. So how long will he be in power? Nobody can say. But I think he's contested more than ever.
Anne-Marie Brady, let's talk about something that you alluded to at the beginning of our conversation. We can show images, if you will, of Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin together at the Beijing Olympics back in February. This was on the eve of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Together they were, and together they kind of projected strength at the time. And, you know, there had been this talk that, you know, liberal democracies are on the decline, and it's people want a strong man in charge, a strong man like the one they have in China, and the strong man like the one they have in Russia. So are we overstretching by saying that really COVID has not been great for those kinds of leaders?
Well, COVID wasn't great for many leaders who didn't handle the COVID situation well. You know, going back to what we were discussing earlier, I think that you know, the Chinese government could do what the Taiwanese government did and the New Zealand government did, which was adjust their policies. We had an elimination strategy in New Zealand where we also, in a different phase of COVID, we're trying to eliminate COVID from our country, and we're an island nation, so that's a little bit easier to do. But the variants of COVID challenged that. So our government had to tell us, hey, we're changing the strategy, and Taiwan's done the same. And it was painful for people because they'd made many sacrifices, but they accepted it. So that would be an option for the Chinese government to say, hey, we're taking a different tack. But that would be a different CCP. I expect that there will be, we've already seen shows of force and an emphasis on political security from Xi Jinping. And I agree that Xi is both strong and weak. So it's going to be a time where it's really important for the international community to speak up and say to the Chinese government that there is a right to peaceful protest. And indeed, the White House did that this afternoon. They've issued a statement about that, and other world leaders should do so also. This is a very dangerous time in Chinese politics.
Yes, absolutely.
But what are you expecting when, for instance, the President of the European Council goes in just a couple of days' time to Beijing?
Yeah, well, that's an opportunity for all world leaders who are going to be speaking, whether with Xi Jinping or from, whether it's a public comment or it's going to be our diplomats speaking to their Chinese diplomatic officials in their countries. They have to use their influence now. And many countries like France and New Zealand and Germany do like to stress that they do have positive relations with the Chinese government. This is the time when they can use those connections and channels that they have. They say that they are listened to, then show us that you can do something with that, something for good, to try and prevent a Belarus-type situation occurring to those brave people who've come out in China in recent days.
Pierre-Antoine Denet?
I tend to agree with you, Anne-Marie. I think it's a very dangerous time in China. But also, you see, talking to the Chinese, of course, we should do that more than ever.
Is the messaging consistent? I mean, we have the French embassy last week saying, open up the country, not on human rights grounds, but simply because it's bad for business and that French expatriates are having a hard time of it working in China.
What I want to say is that when you talk to the Chinese, you talk to Xi Jinping. So you are not listened to. He's doing what he wants. So the difficult thing is to talk to the people there, to have a message that talking to Xi Jinping also talk to the people. And a message of hope that there may be a future after Xi Jinping. But I would like to remind you something which for me is striking. When Mao Zedong felt that he was losing power, what did he do? He started the Cultural Revolution. And my fear is that out of despair or fear, if Mr. Xi Jinping feels that he is losing power, he may do something like that. For example, like launching a war against Taiwan, knowing that most likely China would lose the war. But, you know, just...
China would lose the war.
Oh, yeah. They're not prepared to do it now. By all means, I think they would lose, and they know that. But, you know, if he has the sense that he's losing power, he may become irrational, and that would be a big danger.
William Hurst, is it like Vladimir Putin, whose own COVID vaccine didn't do so great, launching a war against Ukraine?
I don't think it's quite analogous, and I certainly hope that it isn't. I don't think anyone is hopeful for a scenario like that. But I think ultimately China has so many internal issues and domestic problems. Taiwan is only a problem for China if it decides to make it one by instigating a conflict at this stage. So the situation in the cross-straits relationship is actually fairly stable as long as China lets it alone. Which I think they will in the short term at least, because provoking that kind of a crisis could be exactly the thing that, and in fact, destabilizes Xi Jinping's power irretrievably. So I agree that if he really feels threatened, if he really sees the possibility of regime instability or his own instability in power, he might take more extreme action. But I don't think war with Taiwan will be among the preferred options, even in that scenario.
Does it matter, Dongshen Zhang, what the outside world thinks?
Yes, it matters very much. But I think there's a issue here that is, of course, keeping the conversation is always good. Keep the communication is always good. But the problem is our expectation from the West. I think we tend to expect too much from the conversations, and the German chancellor's visit to China seems to be based on that too much expectation from the conversations. Also, the conversations ignores the other narrative that China has, that the chancellor's visit to China is interpreted as the weakness of European diplomacy.
Yeah, because you had Olaf Scholz going to Beijing solo. The French wanted to go with him, and instead the Europeans were divided.
It shows from Chinese perspective that the Europeans are divided, right? So there's always an opportunity for China to exploit that weakness in Europe. So in that sense, that the goodwill of having the conversation, keeping the conversation, may interpret it very differently inside China. Therefore, became a reason for keeping the current policy of China. So our expectations from the keeping the communications channels is too overrated, to use Trump's word. When that happens, it misleads the public opinions. It doesn't help us in understanding China. It doesn't help us in addressing the concerns either on COVID or over the issue of Taiwan.
William Hurst, when you look at what's happening right now, there is, as we mentioned at the outset, this social contract. Chinese citizens stay out of politics, and in exchange, they get growth and they get security. You were mentioning these various strains, not just a youth movement, you said, but also a labor movement, and the possibility that this could snowball what we're seeing inside of China right now. Is it easy to piece back together that social contrast to regain the sort of that bond between the leadership and citizens?
No, it really isn't. But I would also say that the social contract, in terms of delivery of what in China is often called the basically prosperous society, or the sort of small prosperity society for the majority of people, hasn't always really delivered very well for a lot of groups. It hasn't delivered very well for much of the working class. It hasn't delivered very well at all points for rural residents, right? So there have been a number of people kind of losing out, at least in relative terms and sometimes in absolute terms. Those people have been protesting for a long time and have been deeply upset for a very long time. What's interesting now about this is that, as the pictures you're showing now on screen show, these new protesters who are turning out with the white pieces of paper and in other manifestations in central districts of big cities don't appear to be losers from the current political economy in China. To the contrary, they seem to be some of the most well-to-do, some of the biggest winners previously, who are now upset. So I think, movements of losers from sort of ongoing transitions are quite normal. Movements of winners are not, and therefore can be more threatened.
Yeah, in China, by the way, we're wondering how much the country is ring-fenced from the rest of the world, which is what we've seen since the start of COVID. There's been scant coverage of the protests on state media, talk of fire safety rules allowing easier access in lockdown areas is basically the nod they've given. And yet we saw, for instance, in Sichuan province's capital, Chengdu, on Sunday, chants of freedom of the press, freedom of speech. And you got to wonder, we mentioned at the outset those VPNs, Dongshen Zhang, that people are using and that have the authorities nervous. When it comes to getting the word out, do they need traditional media, the Chinese?
The traditional media, if you mean TV, newspapers, official media, that is very much controlled. But the internet, social media seems to be still the powerful tool. You saw in the demonstrations that at Fushikang, the Zhengzhou, that a lot of these people are live broadcasting, streaming the protests, and that is the power of social media, and that is, of course, subject to heavy censorship by the government. But there may be cracks, and there will be room for people to spread the information, to share the expression of anger. I think that's where the civil society is driven by. The official media, as I said, that is very, very controlled.
Official media is very controlled. Pierre-Antoine Denet, are you surprised by what you're seeing?
Yeah, I'm very much surprised because, as we said before, it shows that the Chinese people know much more than we thought that they know. This is one thing. But returning to Mr. Xi Jinping, it's not an obsession because he is the main man deciding everything. He says that Chinese characteristics is based on prosperity, common prosperity, economic development. And if you see, the only legitimacy of the CCP, if it has one, is development, social development, economic development. In 2020, the CCP was very, very happy to proclaim the fact that for the first time in Chinese history, nobody dies from hunger. Well, of course, it didn't say that during the Great Leap Forward, about 40 million people in China died of hunger. But it's somewhat true. But when we see what's happening now, first of all, you have ultra-rich and ultra-poor. the difference is enormous.
Yeah.
But with the GDP rate going down, it's going to create even more social problems. You will have more people on the side of the road, more dissatisfied people. So it's a very dangerous path, because that would show one thing, is that the system of the Chinese so-called characteristic doesn't work. And that would be the failure of the huge project of Mr. Xi Jinping.
And yet, for now, doubling down still on the zero COVID policy. I want to thank you, Pierre-Antoine Donnet, for being with us. I want to thank as well Anne-Marie Brady, William Hurst in Cambridge, and Dongshen Zhang in Seattle. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.